Hello, this is Hollisa Elwine. Welcome back to our study in the book of Esther. We're coming down now to our final points where we're going to pull all this together. Now you'll remember in the last lesson, I asked you to make up a chart so that we could go through these comparisons and contrasts between Joseph and Esther. And we're going to go through these pretty quickly, but you can go back and take some more time and you'll find even more than I found. I didn't take a lot of time to prepare these comparisons. I just wanted to put some things together to motivate you to go find more. So we began that comparison in the last lesson, and now we'll continue. Let's look at Joseph again. Remember when Joseph disappeared, the illusion was given that perhaps he had been torn by wild beasts. Wild beasts is actually one of the 4 altered judgments. And so Jacob has this belief that he's been torn by wild beasts, and that's not actually by accident. He's been set up to believe that. But one of the understandings about the judgment of the wild beast is that it's often associated with jealousy. And we discussed that in previous lessons, the problem between Cain and Abel, and envying someone's wife, so that he would have to say, this is my sister, so that this Pharaoh or this king would not kill me on account of my wife. So there's a jealous spirit associated with the wild beasts. Actually, that is exactly what happened to Joseph. He was torn by wild beasts, but the wild beasts were the jealousy of his brothers. That's what caused him to be sold. Well, Esther is battling the same thing. There's this issue going on between Haman and Mordecai. And Haman is very jealous of Mordecai. Mordecai won't bow to him. He won't pay him the proper reverence and respect and so forth. And he absolutely is working in the capacity of that jealousy, that wild beast judgment against Mordecai. And the problem with that is if it just stopped with Mordecai, that would be one thing. But he includes all of the Jews that are within the province. And so he is about to execute one of the 4 altar judgments, a wild beast and sword judgment together upon the Jews. Also in the text, if you'll read the description of Joseph, he's actually described as a beautiful man. Now that doesn't mean he was effeminate. It just means that he had a very beautiful, attractive appearance. That same description is given of Esther, in fact also of Sarah and of Rebekah. It says they were beautiful women, therefore those kings desired them. Joseph and Esther are both beautiful. Now with Joseph, remember there was a situation that led to his deliverance from prison where a couple of years beforehand 2 people had been put into prison with him. They were both officials of the Pharaoh. One was the chief baker, and the other one was the cupbearer, the person who would take care of the king's wine and actually taste it beforehand to make sure there was no poison in it. I'm not sure I'd want that job. But both of them were under suspicion. They had somehow insulted the Pharaoh, or they were thought to be involved in something that was harmful to Pharaoh. They were put in prison. Well, because of this subterfuge, they're actually put into contact with Joseph, which is eventually going to lead to Joseph's redemption. It just takes a while because the cupbearer forgets. For some reason, you think, well, how could he forget? Some things are just supernatural until the appointed time rolls around. Well, we can see also that Mordecai saves the king from an assassination attempt. There's an attempt on his life, and then Mordecai hears about it and turns in the information, and they're able to execute those that were planning it. Now, the baker is the only one of those 2 that is actually hanged. The cupbearer is actually delivered. Well, in terms of a baker, we could almost associate that with unleavened bread, because it's talking about a bread product or a pastry maker. Of course, that would be the king's dainties, and therefore we have a picture there not just of the bread, but in the cupbearer, the wine. The wine is a picture of Sukkot. So the baker represents death, like Passover and unleavened bread represent the death before the resurrection, but the cupbearer is going to be a picture of the deliverance and, of course, the reward of Sukkot. Now, in Esther, it's Haman, or Haman, who is hanged, but Esther, who very specifically devises a certain type of banquet that's going to be the source of deliverance, not just for herself and Mordecai, but for her people. That type of banquet that she prepares is specifically a wine banquet. She says, lishtot yayin, and that means to drink wine. The whole purpose of that banquet was to drink wine. And so you can see there that just as the cupbearer is going to represent resurrection from the dead, Esther invites the king on the third day to a wine banquet so that coming out of this 3-day fast, she can be that object of deliverance, but she's not going to actually reveal everything until the 4th day. But you can see there those parallel pictures. Now, the cupbearer had a dream, basically with 3 tendrils of grapes that he squeezed into Pharaoh's cup. But the baker's dream was of 3 baskets of baked goods. Each one of those dreams had a 3. Remember, 3 is the number of resurrection. Now, the grapes are going to represent Sukkot, when you would bring the first fruits of your grapes from your wine vat. But there again, the basket in the hand of the baker may not just represent unleavened bread, but a basket is when you bring your produce at Sukkot. It specifically says you'll set the basket down and you'll make this recitation. So you can see there the pictures of the Chagim associated with the 2 men that were put into prison with Joseph. Now we know Esther prepared the wine for the king and for Haman on the 3rd day, but she actually revealed her identity and the plot on the 4th day, which is when Haman was actually hanged. And if you'll read the text carefully, Joseph, when he interprets these dreams, says, these 3 things, these 3 tendrils of grapes, or these 3 baskets, they are 3 days. After 3 days, this will happen. The cupbearer will be restored, but the baker will be hanged. That's what you see in the book of Esther. After 3 days, remember, she doesn't reveal the secret on the 3rd day. It's not until the 4th day that Haman's head is lifted up, and he is hanged like the baker. But she, the one who has prepared the wine banquet, is the one who is being restored to the presence of the king. So, chiastically even, we're still getting pictures of Passover and Sukkot because the wine banquet actually takes place during the period of unleavened bread. If we want to look at it on the menorah, as we look at it right here, then these days right here actually have their origin in the same place, so that these days right here are going to be chiastically connected to them. Remember, unleavened bread officially starts the day after Passover, but in Scripture, those terms are used interchangeably, especially in the Gospels. And so you can see that embedded within all this, there is one Holy Spirit giving you different pictures to help you connect Passover and Sukkot. So you can see those 2 pictures there. All right, next. We can see that as the brothers go up to buy food from Joseph during the famine, famine again is one of the 4 altar judgments, at first he puts them all into prison for 3 days. A prison represents death. The pit represents death in Scripture. Esther had the Jews fast for 3 days. Fasting is seen as a type of death. You're putting the body of flesh to the death so that the spirit may live and have life. Joseph planned a banquet to set up his brothers and expose their evil. Esther planned a banquet to set up Haman and expose his evil. Joseph wept, it says, bitterly when he saw Benjamin, who was about to become subject to his own brother's death decree. So remember it said, and whoever's bag this cup is found, that person's going to die. And then we bargain it down to slave. But it says Joseph has carried out this plan, but then he weeps bitterly when he reaches that point. Once Esther realizes that the original decree cannot be overturned, she goes before the king, and it says she weeps bitterly for her people. She says, how can I bear to see my people wiped out? How can I bear to see the destruction of my people? Well, that's exactly what Judah says to Joseph. When he realizes Benjamin is about to be kept and either killed or made a slave, he goes and he pleads with Joseph for Benjamin's life, and he says, how can I bear to see this happen to my father? He's using almost the same words in the text. How can I bear to see this? Joseph's sale into slavery was the result of jealousy. The genocide decree against the Jews in Esther was the result of jealousy. When Jacob finds out that he must send Benjamin to Egypt, he says, if I'm bereaved, which literally means if I'm lost, if this is lost to me, it's lost to me. Well, when Esther finds out that she must go before the king, when she realizes she could lose her life if she does this, she says basically, a lot of texts say if I perish, I perish, but if you'll read it more literally, it says if I'm lost, I'm lost. It's much closer to what Jacob said. Now, there's a context clue here. Jacob says twice, he uses the form of shakulti in Hebrew, and it literally means to lose a child. When he says, I'm bereaved, it's shakulti, if I'm bereaved. That phrase begins with the Hebrew word ka'asher, shakulti. It's a double verb. Now sometimes we know nouns are doubled, like Moses, Abraham. Well, in this case, it's a double verb, shakulti. And each is phrased in the first person in the past tense. The only other time in the entire Bible that ka'asher appears along with a similarly conjugated double verb is when Esther says, ka'asher avadati. If I'm lost, I'm lost. This is a clear grammatical connection. Esther is identifying here with Jacob's pain. Joseph is elevated to second in command to Pharaoh because of the failure of the fortune tellers and the advisors and so forth who could not interpret the dream. Esther is made second in the nation because of Vashti's failure to appear, which displeased the king, and he's acting here again on the advice of his advisors. Pharaoh's dream is about famine, an altar judgment. The king's sleep is shaken in the book of Esther so that he could be reminded of a murder plot, which is a sword, another altar judgment. They're both troubled with altar judgments. Joseph hides his true identity from his brothers. Esther hides her true identity from those in the palace and her nation. Joseph devises a plan for the brothers' unification and their salvation. Esther devises a plan for the protection of her nation among the nations within that empire and devises a plan for their salvation. Joseph is made second in command to Pharaoh. He's given chariots, horses, robes, jewelry, the signet ring in order to administrate the king's will. Esther is given, along with Mordecai, basically those same objects. Remember, Mordecai had the horse, the robe, the crown, and they were both given the jewelry, the signet ring, to write with his authority, to administrate, to try to write something that would nullify that first decree. Joseph is given a different name when he lives in Egypt. His real name is hinting to Sukkot. Esther is given a new name when she's brought to the palace, but her real name hints to Sukkot. Joseph gives Judah the opportunity to become a deliverer and a substitute sacrifice for Benjamin. But Esther is a Benjamite. And she has the opportunity basically to return the favor, to close the circle, and to lay down her own life as a Benjamite for a Jew. Because the people in the book of Esther are referred to as the Jews. But specifically, Mordecai and Esther, we know that they come from the tribe of Benjamin. And so they have the opportunity to act as deliverers, as Benjamites to Judah. It's reversed. It's backward, and it's great how it works. Joseph prepares a table for his brothers as part of his plan. Esther prepares a banquet table for the king and Haman as part of her plan. 10 of Joseph's brothers participate in the plan to sell Joseph, and originally the plan was to kill him, if you'll remember that. Haman has 10 sons who were hanged with him, who were in agreement with his plan. Joseph speaks another language in front of his brothers because he's concealed himself as a man from the nations, an Egyptian. His decree against Benjamin is actually spoken in a different language. Esther speaks the language of the Persian king, and the decree is made in the language of the king, but it is translated to every other language within the empire. We have here this translation and this interpretation of languages. I mean, that's screaming Shavuot, or it should be. It should be screaming to you, Acts chapter 2. Joseph improves the position of the Israelites within the land of Egypt. He makes them secure in the famine, which is one of the 4 altar judgments. Esther and Mordecai improve the position of the Jews within the Babylonian/Persian, Median, Chaldean Empire. They make them more secure. They secure them from the threat of the sword, which again is one of the 4 altar judgments. Joseph's original disagreement with his brother was over authority. Remember the coat? But he eventually uses that for good. Haman uses an authority issue to secure an evil decree, but Esther uses it for good. Things actually turn out better for the Jews in the end. Joseph is remembered for a good deed he had done 2 years before while he was in prison. The night the king couldn't sleep, he called for the books, and Mordecai was remembered for a good deed he had done maybe 2 years before. Time had passed. Joseph is basically working alone to work this plan to unite Israel's children, but we see Esther, even though she has to go alone before the king, there's some things we just have to do alone. It says Abraham was alone when I called him. Well, he had his whole family with him. But in some cases, we have to go alone. When it comes to deciding, I will give my life, if I perish, I perish. If I'm bereaved, I'm bereaved. You have to make that choice as an individual. But in executing the plan and using the authority to annul the decree, Esther's working side by side with Mordecai and with the consent and the authority of her husband. So she's working with people to unite Judah spiritually within that empire, even in the land of their exile. And that's really what Joseph ends up doing, is uniting his brothers in a land of exile. That's what Judah says. Remember, when he's pleading for Benjamin, he says, how could I bear to see the terrible fate that befalls my father if I don't bring Benjamin back? When Esther falls down and weeps bitterly, she says, how could I bear to see the terrible fate that befalls my people? With the exception of a single syllable, Esther's words are a direct quote of Judah's. A direct quote. You see, in the Hebrew text, there would have been no vowels. We have them now. We would have the dot now to be able to tell the difference. But it's a sound alike. And so basically, there can be a letter or a vowel in the 2 texts. And that would be the only thing that would make them different. In this particular quotation, the different word is Avi versus Ami. Avi, my father, is what Judah says to Joseph. Ami, my people, is what Esther says to the king. In the annulment of vows, we'll see something similar, where it's actually just a syllable that's going to change. Now, in the midst of this story of Joseph, there's this little, almost like a sidebar about Judah and Tamar. And it talks about the cord, the signet, and the staff that verify, number one, Tamar's righteousness as a virtuous woman, and number two, ensure that Judah's authority, his place within the tribes of Israel, his sons and his seed will continue. Well, we see that whereas Tamar has the staff, which is what the common man would have, twice the king will extend his scepter. That is the royal staff. And he's basically saying, Esther, you come under my protection. When you touch this, you are under protection in my house. Judah had sent the same message to Tamar, that now you come under my protection, no harm will come to you. Joseph is sold for silver by his brothers who are jealous of him. The Jews are sold for silver by Haman, who is jealous. Joseph was an orphan. He was orphaned of his mother. Esther was doubly orphaned. And we know that orphans are to receive that special treatment at the feast of Sukkot. Now, there's some other little secrets there within the male and the female roles, but you can see now that there is a similarity in the patterning. And that's what it says in Joel chapter 2, verse 28. It says, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, on your sons and your daughters. They shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and the female slaves. In those days, I will pour out my spirit. So we see a beautiful picture here of Joseph and Esther. We've got a male and a female that are playing similar roles. Some things are a little bit different, but much is alike. So we can see that Joseph and Esther are showing you how this Torah, it gives us a seed of understanding, but the prophets will widen the scope. And Esther is very much a prophetic book. And you can see here the beginnings of something that you will see even more of in the Brit Chadashah. Because most of the focus in the Gospels, at least up until the time of the resurrection, is focused on the male disciples. We get a few little tidbits here and there, but for the most part, he's teaching intensely his male disciples. But after his resurrection, the first person that Yeshua speaks to is Mary Magdalene. Remember? Which column would you put her in? Would you put her in the column of a virtuous woman, a sister, or would you put her in the column of the harlot and the adulterous woman? Because the first word out of Yeshua's mouth after he was resurrected was woman. He's speaking to Mary Magdalene. She's going to be the first eyewitness to the full resurrection gospel. Just as it was prophesied in the Psalms that the women that proclaim the good news are a great army. And that's what he does. He says, woman, go tell the other disciples. They may not believe you, but go tell them anyway. You start to see teaching teams like Priscilla and Aquila. You see Paul sending Phoebe probably with the letter to the Romans to explain it. You hear about Lydia and other prominent women who would host, who would start small congregations, who would give to these projects so that the gospel could go forth. We see this happening with Esther. We see a bigger scope than what we imagined. Now Joseph is 30 years old when he stands before Pharaoh. For 7 years he prepares for a famine, and for 7 years he manages the trouble and the wrath of the famine. That 30 in Hebrew is a lamed, by the way, the Hebrew letter lamed, which means teaching and learning. So the first 30 years of his life, Joseph had to both prepare by teaching and learning, having that interaction. And at that point, he is competent to begin administrating for the king. Well, there's a picture there of the 30 of his age when he starts preparing for the sevens. Well, Vashti's disobedience was in the 3rd year of the king's reign, and the pur, or the lots, were cast in the month of Nisan, the month of Passover, which basically encapsulates 1, 2, 3 in terms of the Moedim, those 3. So you've got 30 here, you've got this preliminary or spring feast days that would carry an identity of a 3, or resurrection, and then the disobedience in the 3rd year. But remember, there's going to be 3s and 7 pictures in both places. Now, Pharaoh's dream involved, of those 7s, cattle and grains. Both of those are actually emblems of Sukkot offerings. You can bring cattle and from your threshing floor at Sukkot for first fruits. But you can also bring from your flocks and your herds, your wine vat. Those things are included as well. Well, Esther is taken to the palace in the 7th year, 7 Sukkot. Sukkot is the 7th feast. Shabbat represents the 7. Esther goes in the 7th year of the reign, and basically the king gives a big banquet called Esther's Banquet. It's like Sukkot. She's in the palace for 7 years of good before she has to start managing this period of trouble. But she is in place because Vashti refused to appear on the 7th day, which is kind of interesting. There's going to be a lot of prophetic meanings tied into that we won't chase down now. But start to research that a little bit. Her failure to appear said she didn't care about the nations, the same way that Cain didn't care about the nations when he didn't bring his first fruits at Sukkot. A lady who doesn't appear, she's no Rachel. She says, I don't care about these children. I don't care about the lost sheep. Joseph, as he's working on his plan, the servants had to be in on it. They had to help him get this set up ready in order to get Benjamin back. Esther coordinates this secret plan with her own young women because she has those young women, her servants, fast with her. So we've got, I don't know if you would call it a role reversal so much as we have a really good balanced picture of how we can be co-heirs. And Messiah Yeshua says with him there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek. Yes, people have primary roles and responsibilities, but just about the time you think you have that nailed down, you'll see a woman pop up over here and fulfill that role. Does that free the man from his obligation? No, it does not. He will always have that primary responsibility, but it doesn't mean that the Spirit will not use a woman, perhaps in that spot. Now, I want you to read Numbers 30 very carefully. Numbers 30, it's called Nedarim, which is vows. In a previous lesson, we talked about how vows are typically paid at the 3 pilgrimage feasts. And again, we're talking about how a male can be given a role to play. He's given an obligation, but all of a sudden we'll look over here and we'll read a passage where a woman is fulfilling the same obligation. So let's look for this in Esther. What are these nedarim? What are these vows? Well, we can break it down by letter, actually. We've got Nun, we've got Dalet, and we've got Resh in Hebrew. Nun actually means fish. Remember, I will make you fishers of men, and it represents productiveness, increasing numbers, great numbers. The Dalet is the door, and it represents authority, or the number 4. Resh is the Rosh, or the head, and it means authority. The head represents authority. So what we have here is a picture of when I take a vow, what I would like to do is increase my productiveness in the kingdom of heaven. In order to increase my productiveness, and to actually walk according to the calling and the plan that He's given me, sometimes I need to actually discipline my flesh. Because through the Dalet, the door, I'm going to allow the Holy Spirit to come in and to deal with me, to deal with my heart, and I'm going to submit myself to the head or the authority of the Holy Spirit. It's the serpent and the beast that deal with our heel. But it's spiritual authority of the Elohim in whose image we are created that deals with the head. So what we always want to do is keep our head over our heels. We never want to get our heels over our head, because that means the nephesh, the part of our soul we have in common with a beast. Remember, the serpent is more cunning than all the beasts of the field. He spoke on their behalf. What he convinced Adam and Eve to do was to get their heels over their head, where the desires and the appetites master the spiritual authority of Elohim. But when I want to work on that, I might take a vow, so that what I'm doing is actually enlarging the door for Yeshua, because he says, I'm the door. I want the Holy Spirit to begin to work on me so that I will have a better grasp of his authority, and so that I can increase his kingdom on this earth. So it's a method, a vow is, by which you signify to the world, because it's an outward sign. Usually people can see what you do because you actually pay the vow in public. Just like Yeshua said, if you'll confess me before people, then I'll confess you before my Father. So you're widening the door of Adonai's authority in your life. So you can dedicate money, objects to him, or you can vow to refrain from something that your soul loves. Maybe it's wine, maybe it's sweets, whatever it might be, whatever that personal sacrifice is. And by doing so, by disciplining your flesh, you're dying that type of death that you might die by fasting, that Esther did, that the Jews did, when she said, basically, if I perish, I perish. And by doing that, I'm showing who the kingdom actually belongs to, especially in my life, in a public way. It's a kind of a living death with a view toward a resurrection, a spiritual resurrection. Now, in the book of Esther, the king has allowed Haman to write a decree with his authority. Now, we can qualify that decree as a vow based on the explanation I just gave, because the motivation of that decree was to widen and to establish the authority of the king among all these 127 provinces. Haman was trying to sell this as the Jews are subverting your authority. They're trying to defy your authority and keep their own. So that decree is going to reestablish in a very public way your authority over this people. And so the king is all for this. He thinks, well, that's a great idea. And so he says, go do that, not understanding really that the motivation there, that ancient problem with Amalek, is there at the root of it. Now, there's a part in the Yom Kippur service called Kol Nidre, and it means all vows. And this part of the service is where individuals pray that if they've said something stupid, if they've made a foolish vow, done something rash, they repent and they ask to be released from the judgment of that vow being unfulfilled. If they've done anything that's ill-advised like that, they attempt. Now, that shouldn't be an attempt to circumvent the Torah, to circumvent the consequences of violating the Torah. But it should acknowledge that we all say impulsive, stupid things from time to time, but we can be repentant and we can request mercy. But the annulment of vows is very much an integral part of the Yom Kippur synagogue service. So as you read through Exodus 30, I want you to think and look, Numbers, think and look for these particular things. Number one, a na'ara, that means a young woman of marriageable age. Number two, the relationship between that young woman and her spouse in his house, or that relationship between the young woman and her father in his house. Because all through these lessons, from time to time, I've hinted, when I show you household, her father's house, and so forth. Look for silence as affirmation. And look for things to be done at specific times. In other words, you don't have all day to figure this out. You need to act now, or at least make a decision now. The hook between Esther and Nedarim, and this is according to Rabbi Foreman, who has written an excellent book about it. It's the Hebrew word lehacharish, and it actually means silence. And Mordecai uses this word in succession. He says, im hacharesh tacharishi. It's a doubled verb. So when the words are repeated, remember, it emphasizes a point. Now, lehacharish appears as a doubled verb only one other place in the entire Tanakh. Would you like to guess where? In the book of Numbers, under Nedarim, the annulment of vows. And what this passage does, it instructs fathers or husbands how to annul the vows of a young woman if they are foolish or if they are damaging, if they're just not good judgment, how to annul that vow when he hears of it. He has to look out for her best interest. Yet, he has to allow her to manage her own spiritual walk. There's a delicate balance there, and he would have to really think, do I need to interfere, or do I need to let her perform this vow? There's just one important rule he has to remember. He has to object and annul the vow as soon as he hears about it. As soon as he hears about it. He doesn't have all day to do it. As soon as he hears, he has to voice an objection. Now, if he remains silent, it is as though he said yes. He cannot remain silent and think too long about it. Because by silence, the hacharish, he upholds the vow. Silence is a yes. And it says this is how a husband or a father deals with a young woman's vows when she is in his house, under his authority. If he remains silent, he can't change his mind later or speak up later. Silence is yes. And it says if he tries to annul it later, he has to bear the sin. No means no. Yes means yes. Silence means yes. And it says in Numbers 30:13, her husband can affirm the vow or her husband can annul it. The grammar there is very important. In fact, the spelling is very important. If you try reading that without the vowels, you'll realize you could actually read it two different ways. Now, the three-letter root of lehacharish comes from a word that means deafness. So in that verb form, Rabbi Foreman is saying what it implies is that the man has made himself deaf. He has chosen not to hear, so he remains silent. It's not that he didn't hear, he just pretended that he didn't hear it. Like if I don't see it, it's not happening. If I don't hear it, it didn't occur. You can't choose to do that. Unfortunately, if he makes no response, he's saying yes, which I'm sure there are no husbands who have ever made themselves deaf when their wives were speaking. But there's danger in that. That's what the Torah is trying to tell you. You better listen. She could say anything, and you might agree to it by silence. And it says if she fails to live up to it, now he bears the sin, even though she's the one who didn't keep it. He's the one who's going to suffer judgment if he keeps silent at that time. In fact, the text seems to imply that the judgment could extend to his house, because he is the head, he's the rosh of the house who guards the door, the delit. He's the one who has to guard against a foolish vow. Now, it's real easy to see that Queen Esther has been put into a position or into a situation of needing to annul the king's rash decree. But she's his wife. She's not his husband. She's not his father. What gives her the right or even the obligation to override this rash decree? Would that Torah obligation extend to her as a wife? Mordecai seems to think so. what does Mordecai say to her? If you remain silent at this time, not any other time, if you remain silent at this time, he says, salvation will come to the Jews from somewhere else, but you and your father's house will be destroyed. You see how he's flipped the role on her? This is interesting. Where would he get this idea? How could he read the text that way when it says her father and her husband? Well, read it in Hebrew. If you have a Tanakh, read the passage in Hebrew, because what it will say is, Isha yekamina ve'isha yeferena. We translate that as her husband can affirm it, her husband can annul it. Now here's the beauty of the Hebrew. Remember, the Torah did not originally have vowel points. So vocalization can actually change the meaning of a word. In this case, Isha means her husband. Ish plus a, which means her husband. Isha, if you know even basic Hebrew, you know Isha means a woman. It's a play on words with the text. There's a double meaning in the text, because if we, again, take that little dot out of there, it really clouds the meaning. Because if we do that, we've not changed one bit of the spelling. We've simply removed a vowel point that wasn't there to begin with. In that case, the text would read, a woman can affirm, a woman can annul. Evidently, Mordecai is reading it this way because it gives it a secondary prophetic meaning. It begins to be something, I don't know what you would call it, maybe a double entendre. Two meanings. So it would read that a woman's husband could annul or affirm a vow, or a woman could annul or affirm a vow. All Mordecai had to do is remove a dot from the word if it was actually there at that time to begin with. So he's telling her she has to make an attempt to annul her spouse's rash decree. It was an unwise vow. He didn't know all the circumstances when he made it anyway. But he says this is not just going to damage you personally if you don't speak up and object. There is a destruction that is built into this decree that is going to actually snap back on you and your father's house. There is a Torah judgment that would actually come on you and your father's house based on how this Torah is constructed. You must object. Even though surely Mordecai understands that the obligation is not Esther's. She's not a husband and she's not a father. But he is reading the text as though it is her obligation and she had better act accordingly. She has to make an attempt to annul this spouse's rash vow, this rash decree. So, what Esther must do is make a decision, because she's not really, enthused about the idea of going before the king without an invitation. After all, didn't he banish the last queen that appeared to subvert his authority? But she realizes she agrees with Mordecai's interpretation of the annulment of vows. And she says, okay, call a fast. Let the Jews fast for 3 days. And if I'm lost, I'm lost. So at the moment that she hears of it and processes it, she voices an objection and she begins to devise a plan. Now, she can't immediately go to the king, but she has voiced the objection in the hearing of others. And that vow can be overturned. The problem is the way that it was written, we can't just void it out. What she actually had to do was come behind it with another decree that would in reality nullify it. But once it's out there, you can't stop it. What you can do is write another that would actually nullify it or make it null, so that it would have no effect, so that it would have no impact. So she's registering an objection. And here's a great thing. remember Purim, they call this Purim. And like we said in a previous lesson, Yom HaKippurim, Yom Kippur, means a day like Purim. Pur is a lot. It's an object of chance that determines fate. On Yom Kippur, the high priest draws lots, or Purim, to designate the fate of the two goats. One is Ladonai. He's going to die before the Lord. Just like Queen Esther said, if I perish, I perish. If I'm lost, I'm lost. That's the way it goes. But I am going to go into that Holy of Holies. I am going to go into his presence, and if I die there, I die there. That's the point of Ladonai. But the lot for the other goat is Lazazel. That lot was actually drawn. Haman's here busy drawing lots to try to kill Mordecai and the Jews, and he doesn't understand. He's pulling down the judgment on his own head. He is becoming the Lazazel that's going to be taken out into the wilderness and destroyed. This is how Purim and Yom Kippur is a day like Purim. We have one figurative goat who's hanged, while the blood of the other goat is admitted into the throne room, into the Holy of Holies, and it is safety for all Israel. Remember, that was atonement and covering for the nations. It was atonement. It didn't mean the decree wasn't there. It meant there was a protective covering over it so that it could do no harm. That was the point of atonement and covering. We can't deny the sin is there. But this decree, this will cover it over. Now, affirm and annul. Those are the two basic premises of the nedarim, or the annulment of vows. A person can affirm this or they can annul this. The Hebrew word for annul is pur. Affirm is kayam. 7 times in chapter 9 of Esther, you're going to find a form of the word pur, which, remember, means annul. But there are also 7 occurrences of the root word kayam for affirm in the same chapter. That's going to add up to 14, which is actually the number of Messiah. Remember the 14 generations that separate the generations of Messiah? So you've got 7, which represents Sukkot. You got another 7 that represents Sukkot, and then a total of 14 of these 2 words, which represents Messiah's generations. It's a picture of Messiah. Because what happens is there is an annulment of the first decree. And by annulment, we don't say that we totally erase it and wipe it out. We can't. It will stand. But what we do is we write something that will bring it to a null effect. Look up the word null. That'll help you. It's still there. We're just making it where it has no power. On the other hand, we can annul 7 times, but not only that, we want to affirm, kayam, 7 times the second set of decrees, which there again is going to grant salvation to the Jews and increase and secure their position in the exile. Why? Because remember, they were a seed scattered out in those 127 provinces of our mother Sarah, the mother of many nations, so that those who would say, oh, I'm Jewish too. I want to identify with this land, this covenant people. I want to be like Ruth. I want to be like Rahab. I want to be like Tamar. I want to come in and draw close to this covenant with you and be one with you. I want to draw near. Yeshua, the generations of Yeshua are telling you that through his blood, his atoning blood, his covering blood, that he has nullified the decrees, not just against the Jews, but against the stranger and the alien that would join themselves to the Jews and say, let us go with you, for we've heard that God is with you. And he is affirming a new decree in us. He is making a new covenant with us. It's a renewal of the old, but it's founded on better promises, because it is enlarging the tent of Rachel, enlarging the tent of Sarah. It's answering the call of Abel, whose righteous blood is still calling out from the ground. Where are the sheep? Where are the lambs? Purim is calling the lambs home. There is prophecy in Purim that we miss because we don't know the Torah. Or if we do know the Torah, we see it as rules and regulations and being correct, and we don't understand that it's about the stranger, the alien, the orphan, the widow, just as much as it's about the native born, the Levite, and the priest. And it says the decree of Esther affirmed these words of Purim. The last time, the last occurrence in chapter 9, that one of those two words for affirm and annul, kayam and pur is used, they're used together in the same verse. And the decree of Esther affirmed these words of Purim. She's affirming this. She's affirming the nations. She's inviting them to a banquet. And there's so many more mysteries in the book of Esther. You know, we've just scratched the surface in these 5 lessons. Just scratch the surface. But if we want to escape the winepress of the king's wrath, we had better figure out what Passover and Sukkot are all about. It's not about me. It's about you. And it's about the person next to me. It's about the stranger, the alien, the orphan, the widow, giving them an identification with the land, the covenant, and the people of Israel. It's including those who would walk in that way, not excluding. It's not a club. It's the mystery of the Gentile. It's a great plan. It's a great plan. So, as we study the book of Esther, we have to realize there was a question in the king's mind. Because when Esther invites him the first time, she says, let the king and Haman come to a banquet I prepared for him, singular. He's sitting there thinking, me or Haman? There again is that question mark. I know Haman wants my robes, my crown, my horse. He thinks I'm talking about him. Now he wants my queen. It was the greatest setup of all time. And it was for the Sukkot of the nations.